Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
This is Paige, the co-host of Giggly Squad, and I want to tell you about a company that I've been loving, Olive & June. Olive & June gives you everything that you need for a salon-quality manicure in one box. And if you break it down, it really comes out to $2 a manicure, which is absolutely insane. It's also so easy to get salon-worthy nails at home with Olive & June. The difference between how your nails used to look when you did them yourself and now with the Mani system is a complete game changer. The best thing about Olive & June, too, is it's a quick dry. Dries in about 1 minute, lasts for 5 days, and full coverage in up to 1 to 2 coats. Visit oliveandjune.com/perfectmani20 for 20% off your first system. That's oliveandjune.com/perfectmani20 for 20% off your first system.
Wow.
Nice.
Yeah.
What you're hearing are the sounds of people everywhere putting on Bombas socks, underwear, and T-shirts made from absurdly soft materials that feel like plush clouds. Yeah, that plush. And the best part? For every item you purchase, Bombas donates another to someone facing homelessness.
Bombas. Big comfort for everyone. Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST. Code ACAST.
Hello and welcome back to part 2. You're probably getting used to me saying that by now. We are back on the Napoleonic Wars pod, and we are continuing with the Copenhagen Conundrum. Yes, I'm still attempting the alliterative titles. Feel free to groan. But if you want to write in and complain, don't expect me to listen. It's probably not a good point for me to remind you to like, subscribe, and review on your favourite podcasting channel. But nonetheless, feel free to do so. It all helps with the algorithm. But we are back today with Gareth Glover, who I am going to spare the embarrassment of an exalted introduction, other than to say, if you don't have some of his books in your library, I am judging you and you need to rectify it. The guy has written so many important titles that you just need to look at his website and pick some things for Christmas, people, because Santa needs to improve your reading. Gareth, just remind people of your, is it garethglover.com or .co.uk?
Sorry, you know, the website.
Yes, please.
It's the garethglovercollection.com.
Okay, there you go, folks.
So it's it's just garethglovercollection.com.
So there you go, folks. That's where you need to be going in order to plan your Christmas list. Gareth, ordinarily I would ask how you're doing, but we literally stopped recording like 120 seconds ago. So I'm guessing you haven't come down with a horrendous ailment in the last 2 minutes.
Thankfully, no.
No, well, that's good to hear. We're going to dive straight back into this. So, folks, if you haven't listened to part 1, please do, because there's a whole stack of context that you will have missed. And we got as far as basically trying to work out why, well, Gareth knows and I don't, why make the decision on firebombing? Was there any other way? To which the answer effectively seems to be, well, no, not really. There is one question that I left out of the first half, though, which was about precedent. Has this been done before? Is there a playbook on how to make this happen? Or are they just kind of, and also in terms of like the moral implications of this, are people able to point to something to just sort of ease their concerns? Or is this very much a sort of step in the dark?
You've got to look back through history. This actually almost comes down to the rules of chivalry, which there's even a question mark if they ever even existed. But at the end of the day, supposedly everyone was trying to follow the rules of chivalry. And when you got to the situation of you were going to try to take a city, throughout the medieval period, it had been quite normal to do whatever you liked in the way of throwing things in there, sort of dead bodies to sort of start diseases. Hopefully they had the plague, which was even better. Sort of you try and to firebomb the place. I mean, even in those days, they were actually using incendiaries in any way they possibly could, and starving them, trying to cut the water supplies, everything to make life as impossible as possible for those inside, and knowing that huge numbers of not just combatants within the fortress, but those poor civilians who are stuck in there as well will suffer in many different ways, and large numbers will die. Now we then come into the 17th century, etc., and there starts to become a little bit more of a tacit agreement on a number of things, and one of them is that once you've actually formed a breach in the walls of the actual fortress, then you should actually surrender. You shouldn't put the actual attacking force through that terrible storm that has to happen otherwise, where huge numbers of the attackers get killed, who will then eventually, obviously, almost certainly succeed, having formed the breaches, and then will go out of control and cause problems within the city, huge problems, deaths, destruction, raping, whatever. And unfortunately, that had started to happen. But then by the time of the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon specifically had actually started ordering his garrison commanders and his governors of these places that, even after the first breach, you don't surrender. You have to actually at least defeat the first storm. And then, of course, that means that you are getting into the situation where, as exactly happened in Spain and Portugal, is that, Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz, etc., San Sebastian, where once the attackers get in, they are so riled up, and having seen so many of their friends maimed, ripped apart and sort of killed, etc., that all sense of decency, and I'm not defending it, I'm just explaining what seems to happen, is all form of decency fails, and all the social norms just disintegrate. They get drunk, and then they just literally take their revenge on whoever they can actually come across, whether they're civilian or an actual soldier or anything else. Actually, quite often, in fact, it's actually strange, but in fact, the soldier in uniform is often still treated okay. It's the civilians that get the worst of it completely. So it's almost like the false honor situation still working. So all of that has happened in the past, and therefore, sort of launching weaponry against the city has been known since before the Romans. Everybody's been doing it, and it's a normal thing to do. So it isn't strange or unusual to do it on this occasion. Perhaps what is less obvious is probably the reasons why it's happening, and that's why it gets a bit of a strange sort of viewing. Is that it depends. If you actually understand why the British Army and Navy are there to take the fleet, then you can possibly understand why they're doing this to actually achieve their goal. If you don't understand that because they're attacking a neutral country, you're never going to understand the fact that they've actually now raining fire and brimstone onto the city. And those two views are never going to really come together, although I've done my best to try to bring that together. But you understand that there clearly are two sides to this, and there probably always will be.
Yeah, absolutely. You can completely understand people looking at this from a moral standpoint and going, that is awful. If you actually take yourself outside of it and look at the strategic side of things, you can reach a point where you go, that is absolutely horrendous. That is really quite shameful. But I can also understand why they made those judgment calls, and I think that's probably where I've reached with this.
Mhm.
Others are welcome to disagree. They might kind of turn around and take the Machiavellian approach. I am quite Machiavellian, but I do kind of look at this and go, this is not Britain's finest hour. Others are welcome to disagree. That's the whole process of writing history. The other thing I wanted to ask about this, sorry, just before we get onto that, one thing I will say to our listeners, 1812, why do you think we burned down the White House? We're not angels. Sometimes we do these things. So there are pockets of this throughout the period, albeit, as Gareth's alluded to, Theodore Rodrigo, Battle of San Sebastian, 1812, 1813. Burning of the White House is War of 1812. I forget which year. Apologies, folks. It's not my fault.
1814, I think. Yes, it is 1814. But you have to put it on the other side of the coin, Zach. If you're going to mention that, you have to say that don't forget the Americans had already been to the capital of Canada, which was then York, and actually burnt that down previously. So it was a deliberate act of retaliation.
Indeed. So look, it's messy during this period. They might have, positioned themselves as gentlemen, but it's war, people. Horrendous things happen. The important thing is to make sure that we don't just brush the horrendous things under the carpet and go, oh, well, ain't that a shame? Hence episodes like this. So in amongst all of that, you've obviously got the civilians, who are the ones who are perhaps most deserving of sympathy, pity, call it what you will.
Yeah.
Now, in Spain, and particularly within the context of Badajoz, I'm not so sure about Ciudad Rodrigo, but I suspect in relation to Ciudad Rodrigo, certainly in relation to San Sebastian, there are evacuations. People have the option to leave, or they actually get kicked out because anybody who's inside the defences is a mouth to feed. And you don't particularly want large numbers of mouths to feed when you're about to be cut off from your supply lines. So is there an equivalent that then helps to scale down the civilian casualties?
There are some evacuations, but it's not in huge numbers of the civilian population. What it is the remaining members of the royal family, the nobility of Copenhagen, and the diplomats and heads of the government who don't fancy having fire rained on them actually move out of the city, leaving the rest of the poor inhabitants to their own. Shocked. Yeah, it's not their greatest moment.
No, it's not. Okay. So the poor people are left to die and burn, literally.
Yeah.
And the rich guys get out. Not their finest hour, as you say.
No.
Let's start to talk about the operations themselves.
Mm-hmm.
We mentioned in the last show, fan favorite Wellesley is involved with this operation. He has that moment of what I would class very dubious glory at the Battle of Koga. I've probably mispronounced that horribly.
I believe, and if there's any Danish people there, please correct me, but I think it may be Koja.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll go.
I've heard a number of different versions of it, so it is difficult.
Okay, we'll go with your pronunciation because you're better placed to know than me. Now, there are plenty of comments that could be made in relation to this about the fact that Danish troops still have their clogs on in some cases. Talk us through how we get to Koja, why we're there, the quality of the force, and then perhaps we'll kind of deal with what actually happens at a tactical level in due course.
Yeah, fine. Basically, obviously, you've got the British Army facing Copenhagen, really, encircling as much of it as they can on Zealand to actually stop any sort of supplies getting in, etc., and preparing to actually bombard if necessary. Now, while it was going on, as I said, Cathcart was constantly concerned that troops could appear in his rear. And in fact, he starts getting rumours that a Danish force is approaching across Zealand towards him. Now, the numbers he gets given are around about 5,000 to 6,000, and it is quite clear that that his understanding is that they are probably not the best of troops. They're actually going to be local. As far as I'm aware, most of them are known as Landwehren, which is like a reserve force, which is meant to be that they are ex-soldiers, rather than just being a militia that's just sort of picked from the local farms and all the rest of it. However, the description that comes out would actually seem to say that the British who saw some of these soldiers they don't sound like old veterans. They actually sound a lot more like farmer hands that have been dragged in. So there is some sort of question mark over how much of a force of Landwehren they were. They were officially Landwehren, but how much they were really old reservists type thing. But anyway, having heard that this force is moving into his rear, clearly it is a concern. He needs to do something about it. So he reorganizes his lines just outside Copenhagen, and Wellesley is already in command of a force called the Reserve, and he turns to Wellesley and effectively says, right, put a plan together of how you're going to effectively face up to this threat that's coming in from in the rear. And Wellesley immediately marches his men towards Roskilde, which is where he is the last mention there has been of them. Wellesley's actually given some, he's actually got some regiments that people might know quite well. He's got the 95th, he's got the 52nd and the 43rd. Now, this is not a light brigade, but you know, this is effectively what we're talking about. 92nd Highlanders with them as well. There was a 6th KGL, and there were some KGL Hussars. That was his cavalry, plus a couple of batteries of artillery as well. So Wellesley moves towards, as I said, towards Roskilde. He there finds that, in fact, this force has heard that there is something coming towards them and has moved to Koja. And Wellesley, therefore, aims to attack at Koja, but he does it with two forces. And we'll talk about that in a minute if you want to. But he is going towards a force that is, in his understanding, of a relatively equal size. And he doesn't know the quality. So, you know, he doesn't know what he's coming to. But there is certainly, if they've had rumors of the troops being on the island already, it's almost certainly they knew they were militia slant Landwehren. But clearly they haven't faced any of them in the field and don't know totally what they're going to see. But he has to know that he's up against a force of a similar size to himself.
Okey-doke. So Wellesley kind of heading into that, you can understand why the Danish aren't too keen to head headlong into one of these engagements. I guess the simple thing is sort of talk us through what happens. What's the plan? What happens in reality?
Well, I'll start off with the fact that Wellesley actually feels confident enough to actually split his force in half, into two pieces, which would indicate that he maybe has some inkling of the qualities up against their militia, etc. He has the idea that he will march direct on Koja. It's Koja itself, while half his force and Linsingen, who is actually a German within the British Army, will actually take the other half and basically pass round to the north across a bridge further to the north, with the intention of falling into their rear, with obviously the intention of cutting off the entire force. But as I said, although it's never mentioned anywhere, to actually plan to do something like that would indicate that he thinks his 3,000 men in front of 6,000 is actually going to be perfectly adequate and is not going to be under threat, you know, because otherwise you wouldn't split your force like that, would you?
You wouldn't. And there are sort of, you hear echoes of that actually with Relitha, don't you? Or Relisa, apologies,
Yes.
folks, in the, Wellington has the confidence there to go for the pincer movement, and that inevitably means a degree of a split. So it does say something about Wellesley's confidence going into this. How did the Danes respond?
Well, the Danish really weren't very good at maneuvering, etc. So, and they were relatively ill-trained troops. So they set up a position just to the north of Koja. There is some mention of being just behind a stream. So some mention a stream, although I can't find one on the map now. So whether, but that area has been messed around with a lot, and a lot of things have been piped underground, etc. Now, so it's quite possible it's gone under the town, which is hugely bigger now. But they basically put their cannon out front, actually sort of had their troops lined up behind it with the intention of they would just sort of hold their ground and let the British advance, basically, and defeat them as they come forward. They obviously start firing their cannon, and a few of the 92nd get hit, etc. And quite quickly, the 92nd and the 95th get ordered forward to advance, basically, and to start bring them under fire. And as soon as they do, the Danish defense really starts to collapse. And it's not long before the entire force has decided the best thing to do is to run away and save themselves, which requires them then to actually run through the narrow streets of the village, back over the single bridge over the river behind them, which doesn't seem to have actually sort of occurred to them as being a problem, where they had a reserve holding that bridge. So there was a reserve to ensure that the bridge stayed in their hands. But clearly you have to obviously get them all back across the bridge. And in fact, when the actual 92nd arrived there, they do actually also capture a cannon actually on the bridge. So they've actually put a cannon there to try to actually stop the British coming up and crossing it. But as you said, one of the things you said earlier is it's known to many as the Battle of the Clogs, because clearly if you're trying to run away in a situation like that, wooden clogs does not help your ability to move any iota at all. So most of them just literally discarded them rapidly and ran barefoot down the road and across the bridge. Having got across the bridge, they thought they were okay because, of course, Linsingen's turning movement. This has all happened a little bit early because Wellington didn't want this to happen until Linsingen had actually got his force round the back at the bridge area, which would have then meant they were all captured. Linsingen unfortunately arrived to find the bridge he was going to cross had been severely damaged and he couldn't get the men across quickly enough. So, and the 92nd, etc., were sent forward a little bit quicker than I think it was all intended. So it all, and certainly I don't think Wellington expected it to collapse as fast as it did. So as they then retreat, Linsingen's force then comes round, which of course includes most of the cavalry, and they start to actually chase the remains of this force away. But I did say there was a reserve force at the bridge, and the 4 battalions there managed to stay formed and drop back to a village, which I've got to remind myself, if I can never remember it, Hefolga. I have been there actually a long time ago now, where there's a church on a hill, and they actually used, and that's got a wall around it, and they actually use that as a final defense position, and one battalion actually holds that to try and hold the British back while the rest escape. But basically the cavalry are then sent off across Zealand, chasing down these sort of these Danes as they run away, hacking down many of them, capturing some, but the majority of those captured were actually at Hefolge, at the church, where General Oxholm, who is actually commanding the whole thing, is actually captured, and about 1,400 men as well. So of the force, about a quarter actually are captured. Another few hundred are killed. We don't know how many more got killed afterwards in the chase across the countryside. I mean, potentially lots more, but there's nobody to record it, so we don't know. And that brought the action to an end, shall we say.
Sounds like a pretty uneven, one-sided engagement with a sort of an air of inevitability about it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The Danes had really no chance at all. They were not prepared for the sort of troops, the experienced troops they came across. It is almost celebrated as Wellesley's first European victory. Yeah, he's known as as a sepoy general before this, and he needs a European victory. But even he is relatively quiet about this one. He doesn't exactly shout it from the treetops. Some of those who write about him later talk about it as this great, his first European victory. But he is quite mute on the subject, if I'm honest. And to be honest, when you then read the few accounts we have of what the prisoners look like, etc., from the British officers, there is almost an embarrassment in that, the fact that they've had to face such inadequate forces. Yeah. And they literally do describe them as farmhands who look like they've been given a musket literally the day before and have really no idea what they're doing with it.
You've just preempted what was going to be my next question, so nice work. You're getting used to how I operate, clearly. I was curious about whether or not Wellesley sort of tries to sort of talk it up. He does that on occasion, Alwera being the most famous example of that. But clearly he sort of takes one look at what happens at Kosher and just sort of decides, I've done a job, but there's not a huge amount to celebrate.
Yeah.
Is that the mood within camp and within the government when news gets back? Do they sort of have an awareness that this really isn't much? It's just...
No, I mean, you have to bear in mind, he has to give in an official sort of report on the battle, which he sends to Cathcart, and so does Linsingen, who as well. And clearly within that, they do describe having defeated this number of men and all the rest of it. But he is not shouting in great, sort of praiseworthy, sort of asking for praise for how well his troops have acted and how well he's acted as a general. I think reading it is quite muted. It's very matter of fact. It just gives the information of. I tend to look more at how he acted around others afterwards, and the few comments we get about him at the time is that it really is not mentioned by him at all. He's certainly not going around sort of looking for laurels on the back of it.
I mean, there are plenty of people that we come across in life who would absolutely want a medal for what happened there, but clearly Wellesley not one of them on reflection. Let's just pause and consider timescale in all of this, which is obviously important. So where does Kosher fit in with the arrival in terms of that timescale, and at what point does the bombardment actually begin?
Right. Well, we're now sort of mid-August, if I remember off the top of my head, and the bombardment's not really up until early September. So we're talking the 2nd to the 5th of September. So we're talking. They've been ashore a couple of weeks, and they've got another couple of weeks before they actually get to bombard. So August is largely spent in preparing the whole operation. It's a huge operation to get all these guns ashore into position and sort of ready to fire. So it is massive, but it's halfway between, really, in a sense.
And what sort of preparation are the Danes doing? Because you mentioned you've got an engineer as governor in charge of everything.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys aren't dumb. They must have looked at the various options available to the British and decided that they're either going to come over the walls or they're not, and if they're not, then they're going to bombard. So is there a sense of preparation in terms
there definitely is, and I've managed to find a few sort of posters of the period as well, actually, which they were giving out sort of sort of public announcements, whereas you get the sort of the wartime stuff, sort of Second World War, we think, but he was doing it then. They were putting out things like, expecting sort of shells to land in place, etc. So that almost how to deal with a shell landing in your house, sort of having buckets of water on each landing ready to go type thing, so you can douse the shell, and if it hasn't exploded, you might be able to put it out before it goes out, it goes off, and lots of things like that, or how to actually protect your family by taking them further down into the house or whatever, into the cellar, etc. So I mean, it is relatively basic stuff, but we are at a time where we're talking about, sort of, there is our thoughts about how they can do things. There's even things like, I mean, because the majority of the water supply for the city came from the reservoirs outside. Now, of course, they got cut pretty damn quickly, but they actually did a survey of all the wells in the city, and they found hundreds of wells. So they were able to say, in fact, actually, if we use all these wells and organize teams of people to be constantly drawing from the wells, we've got plenty of water. We're not going to actually run out of water. So there were lots of, a lot of preparations. And as I said, certainly the Navy were well aware that there was a very good chance that they may be shelled in an attempt to destroy them or something like that. So as I said, they were already working on things like sort of covering the decks to try to stop the shells setting things afire, etc., and taking down the masts and the sails, etc., so that you're and even soaking the decks, etc., anything at all to try and stop that sort of incident happening. So yeah, in all areas they were, and they were trying to get organized. Certainly the defenses were organized. They had, each regiment that was in the actual thing was given a specific bastion or a couple of bastions to actually keep, and all the rest of it, and until the last. So everything possible was done. But clearly, and they had a reasonable amount of time, but the biggest problem for them was that they could only rely on what they already had within the city. Yeah, there was no ability to bring more in. And one incident, funny enough, which we haven't actually mentioned, but earlier on in the early days, we have the main stores for production of gunpowder and for actually some of the heavy guns, etc., were up in the north in Frederiksberg. And two convoys actually tried to get into the city, but both were turned away by German cavalry and chased back to Frederiksberg. And when the cavalry got to Frederiksberg, the battalion of Danish troops that were actually defending Frederiksberg actually were there in square waiting to face them, and were so frightened by the couple of squadrons of actual King's German Legion cavalrymen sort of waving their sabres around, a bit like the new sabre I see that a certain person we're talking to has actually just bought.
They did indeed inquire a 1796.
Yes. And they promptly surrendered. And so therefore the British got all of the actual gunpowder, all of those heavy guns that should have been in the city. And obviously they were kept away from them. The odd bit, the little extra bit to the story I love in a sense, is this is very much a case of troops following the rules, should we say. So because the British, there were no infantry around, there was literally a couple of squadrons of German cavalry, and they're thinking, well, we can't stay up here, we've got a job to do elsewhere. So they turned to the Danes and said, right, you are under parole, but we can't, obviously, we can't take you anywhere at the moment. We will leave you in charge of all of this stuff here, but you are now under obligation not to supply any of it to the Danish army. And that's exactly what they did. They stayed there. They happily stayed in Frederiksberg, away from the fighting. It made sure that nobody got the gunpowder and the guns, and they stayed there until the British sailed away months later.
There's never been a faster or easier way to start your weight loss journey than with PlushCare. PlushCare accepts most insurance plans and gives you online access to board-certified physicians who can prescribe FDA-approved weight loss medications like Wegovy and Zepbound for those who qualify. Take charge of your health and speak with a board-certified physician about a weight loss plan that's right for you. Get started today at plushcare.com/weightloss. That's plushcare.com/weightloss. PlushCare.com/weight loss.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom, like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
That's mad. That is completely mad. But it also gives you an indication of how important the honor of a word is during this period. And that mentality that if you give your word, it's not... you're absolutely going to stick to it. It's a completely different rationale. I would give you good odds on the concept that if you did that today, you would not get the same outcome. But that's
absolutely not. No,
but then conversation.
That's exactly. The other thing I was going to say on top of that is of course, obviously, you have to mention that Napoleon actually ordered his officers to actually break their parole in Britain. So, there are a number of cases where high-ranking officers actually escaped back to Europe, and he employed them straight away. Interestingly enough, he didn't employ them again in the peninsula. He employed them in Russia instead. I'm not totally sure they actually probably made the right decision in a sense, because many of them didn't come back out of Russia. But at the end of the day, parole was actually seen as something that was sacrosanct. If you took parole, that was it. And the Brits were horrified when the French started breaking parole.
Yeah, interestingly, I've just been working on the grave of a guy, a naval admiral. His name is Jackson. And it seems that he is an unusual instance of a British naval officer breaking parole, because he seems to have done some things that would come straight out of a Sharp's novel in terms of sort of running away a couple of times and trying to get back across the channel. But it's interesting that Napoleon has a much more kind of fluid concept of parole and whether or not it should be adhered to.
I suppose I don't know. I do know of Jackson, but I can't remember the story as such. But the only thing I would say is, I suppose you'd have to confirm that he actually did give his parole, because if he didn't give his parole and he was a prisoner of war, he had every right to try and escape.
That is a good point. Some research needs to be done.
Yes.
We'll continue that conversation another time, I suspect. Back to Copenhagen. Let's talk about how long it takes once the preparations are in place, once the order is given to open fire. How long does it take for the Danes to just go, this can't be sustained, and how much damage is done in the process?
It was really over about three nights, really. They tended to, the British artillery tended to wait till nighttime. I think there was also a specific element in this. This is a psychological bit of, when you're weakest at nighttime, you want rest, and suddenly you just get shells and cannonballs crashing through, and obviously rockets firing through as well. But it was through the nights they were doing it, right into the early morning, and then they would rest themselves during the day, and then they would start again. It's not 100% that, but it was largely overnight they were doing it. But it was the second, third, and fourth, and by the morning of the fifth, when it continued that morning, the locals were basically hounding Payman to actually call a halt to it and to actually just give in. So it in a sense, it had worked, because it had done, which obviously in other wars it hasn't managed to do, is to actually get the civilian population to turn around and say to the army, we can't do this anymore. You've got to give in. Yeah.
Is Copenhagen a wooden city?
At that stage, yes.
Okay.
Quite a large part of it is a medieval wooden city. And in fact, if you go there now, you will actually find it's a very, what I would call a European city, very straight lines, crisscrossing, etc. in much of it. Much of that has happened because the medieval city burnt a great deal in this period, and of course that gave them the perfect opportunity to actually redesign the city. So the plan of the city changes quite dramatically. Street plan changes quite dramatically after this.
How much does end up being damaged? Do we have an estimate in broad terms?
It goes all over the place. I mean, around about a quarter are either damaged or burnt down completely. But it's, those estimates can go all over the place. I mean, you can read estimates of from about 15 to 20% up to 45%. I would say around about 20-25 is realistic, and it's mostly that medieval quarter where the majority of it happens. Although other things are also targeted. So, for example, the main the highest steeple in the entire city was used as target practice by the Royal Artillery, and it was almost like a game as who's going to bring it down. Unfortunately, that meant that part of the city also got quite a pounding as well. And in fact, eventually it does come crashing to the ground. And in fact, and every Danish illustration of this bombardment will show you a spire on fire or crashing to the ground, and that is this famous church coming to the ground.
What's the church called, out of interest?
Do you know, off the top of my head, I just gone completely off my head. I'll have to remember it, and I'll tell you in a minute. But
no worries.
Well, like I say, I have been to the church. It has now got a tower rather than a spire, but it does have a picture in there of what it looked like previously. But they didn't rebuild a spire afterwards. It's a long name, and I can't remember it off the top of my head. I do apologise.
No worries. No doubt our Danish listeners may be able to help us out on that, even though they do make up less than 1% of the listenership. So we've talked about the rebuilding process already as part of this. What are the terms? Is it quite simply, look, just give us your boats and we will leave? Is it as simple as that, or is there any kind of debate about, well, can we have this, and we'll exchange Y and all the rest of it?
Oh yeah. No, it was quite complicated, and Wellesley was very much involved in these discussions. They had to give over the citadel and the arsenal, etc., and the dockyard over to the British Army. So, in fact, British soldiers were marched into those specific spots, but the rest of the city was left to the Danes. Okay, so that was the first thing. But then, obviously, there was a longer discussion about the fleet being taken, etc., and what was going to be taken. Clearly the ships were going to be taken, but what other stores and everything else? Well, I mean, it got to the point where at one stage one of the Danish officers was actually sort of annoying Wellesley, and supposedly he retorts with something like, every single piece will go back. Everything, General. Everything. Yeah, I've seen. So he's meaning literally, the sort of the fires for warning and the sort of warming the the clerks in the offices, anything at all, not just naval stores, but anything they could take. But it was specifically that it would be the military stores that were going. Private individuals were not under threat and did not lose anything that we know of. There are no reports in this case of, well, in fact, obviously not many British troops went in, and the few troops who were in there actually treated the locals fully correctly. There wasn't a storming or anything like that, and therefore it was understood that private individuals and their belongings are still theirs, and it's sacrosanct. So it was purely military stores that were being taken.
How do the locals respond to the Brits when they're inside the walls? Because obviously, you've got all this devastation. A quarter of the city is in ashes or damaged. And you can imagine that, tempers would fray, even if the Brits are sort of confining themselves to the military essentials in terms of not only where they're based, but also what they're taking. You can still imagine people sort of shouting insults and starting to throw stones and all the rest of it.
Yeah, no, to be honest, it was more of a stunned silence. I think they were in complete shock at what has happened to the city and what had happened to them after a century of peace, and they just never saw it coming. And the majority of the sort of conversations you get from soldiers at the time is very much that they were treated with respect, but not with love, which I would imagine is probably as much as they were expecting.
Yeah, completely.
Sorry, can I come back to you? As I said, because I thought I'll just flick through the book while I'm doing it, because it was annoying me. I couldn't remember the name of it. It was the Frøykirke, which is actually, or in English, the Church of Our Lady, which is the famous church with the very tall steeple that came crashing down.
There you go, folks. Answer to your earlier question. Fantastic. This obviously goes back home. I mean, I'm not just talking about the fleet, but the news of what's happened goes back home.
Yeah.
At that point, it's going to make its way into the press and Parliament. You can plan this in secrecy, but now the news is out there.
Yeah.
Which inevitably leads to a reaction. So how do press, Parliament, and public react to the fact that Britain has gone and stolen a fleet from a neutral power by raining fire down on their capital city?
I think you can class it as national embarrassment of the greatest scale possible. Everybody, from the king who had actually sanctioned this, really with his arm tied behind his back, because Parliament were almost the government were pushing him to agree to doing this, and he really didn't want to do it, and the result was very much a case of very against what he wanted to happen. I think, everyone could see that a neutral country had been attacked. And yes, there had been a point behind it, but the whole attacking a neutral really went down badly. And certainly the cartoonists of the period make it very clear that, as you've said earlier, it was clearly not one of Britain's finest hours. And there were very, very many people in Britain who were prepared to publicly declare how dreadful it was that we'd ever even considered doing this.
Yeah, that doesn't entirely surprise me. And I do need to double back a second and ask something that I should have done. The fleet, there was an order to scuttle the fleet if needs be.
Yes.
Clearly that didn't happen. What went wrong?
Well, it seems like Admiral Steen Bill got the message and then didn't pass it on to anybody else. All right. Now, it's a very strange one, because when the Prince Regent comes back to Copenhagen after everything is settled down, he basically goes for anybody that had anything to do with agreeing to the armistice and the fleet being taken. So Payman and all the other officers who signed these treaties, etc., are castigated. Some are actually even threatened with death, with public execution, etc. But Steen Bill somehow managed to worm his way into the Prince Regent before he got back, and met him first of all and got his side of the story across. And it seems that after that, he couldn't do anything wrong, and the Prince Regent wouldn't change his view of him afterwards. So when it then becomes a case of, well, the Navy didn't actually do what it was supposed to happen, the evidence would appear to say that Steen Bill probably blamed other people for not carrying out the orders, or claiming he never got the orders, somewhere along those lines, because clearly he doesn't pass it on to anybody else, but there is evidence that he knew about it. Payman certainly says that he knew about it, and he knew about it, but it was down to the Admiral to deal with it. So I think basically Steen Bill doesn't. I don't know if you've seen a portrait of Steen Bill. He's not the nicest looking chap I've ever met, or the most. He doesn't look as if he'd be the great party man. Let's put it that way. He looks like he would. I think he would sell his own granny by the looks of it, if he got him into the top position. And that probably is true. It's probably not far off the truth, because in 1801 he certainly actually makes sure that others take the blame for everything that goes wrong there, should we say, and he comes over it smelling of roses, and he manages to do that here again.
I thought you were going to say that in 1801 he actually sold his granny. I thought that was where you were going with that.
I haven't discovered that evidence yet.
Well, if anybody's able to shed any light on whether or not Steambill actually did that, I would be interested, if only for the comedic value. I've got a very dumb question incoming, but before I get to that, I'm just
surely not
about,
from you.
Well, it only happens like every single podcast. This is obviously an embarrassing situation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to match up the timelines in my head in terms of what's happening in Portugal versus what's happening here.
Literally months apart. There's not much in it at all.
No, exactly. And I'm wondering, to what extent does Napoleon look at this and go, look, the Brits are doing what the hell they like. I'm going to do what the hell I like. Is there any sense that Napoleon looks at this and goes, well, anything's fair game in Europe now, and uses this as an excuse to legitimize what he does in Portugal? Apologies, because I can't quite remember the dates.
No, the timescale's the other way round. The Portuguese situation has started earlier. In fact, it's quite difficult for Napoleon to actually claim that, because at the end of the day, he's already on the march towards Portugal when this happens. The only thing is, although we know that the actual Portuguese fleet does escape, it's not specific that he's there just to actually capture the fleet. He also wants to capture Portugal, full stop. Yeah. So it's caught up in a bigger story there, but certainly as far as the Brits are concerned, it's another fleet that's under threat, and it's already under threat because they're on the march there. So it really reinforces the British view that, yes, we've got to save these fleets because he's definitely after them. Whereas for Napoleon, I think it was a bit of an afterthought with Portugal, but certainly, and even with Denmark, I think there was as much of an argument that he wanted to bring them into the continental system in both cases as well, to actually keep the pressure on Britain that they couldn't sort of sell all their wares, should we say, which was going to ruin the British economy eventually. Yeah. So it was more to do with that than the other things, because although, yes, there is a possibility he could have done some with the fleets, there was nothing specifically planned. The Irish thing is a red herring.
Okie doke. So that was one question from a position of ignorance. Here is, and I even described this as such in the questions that I sent you. It's the dumbest question I've probably ever put to a guest on this show. What impact does this have on Anglo-Danish relations? If you hadn't worked out the subtext of all of this by now, folks, then forgive me, you need to go back and have another listen, I think. But I don't mean that quite in sort of the facetious, dumb sense that it comes across. I've seen this as sort of basically we push the Danes into the arms of Napoleon. You did make the point, though, earlier on that the Danish preference is for neutrality. So
yeah.
How do they respond to this?
Right. Well, as I said, yeah, I've been saying that literally for the last century, they've been sitting on the fence. This is the moment where they realize that sitting on the fence doesn't work anymore. It tips them off the fence completely, and the Prince Regent jumps firmly into Napoleon's side. In fact, Denmark becomes his staunchest ally in some ways, because in fact they are the last country to turn against Napoleon in 1814. Absolutely last country to actually to come against him. So once they jumped, they didn't want to mess around anymore. They just stuck with him. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's not a dumb question in a sense, but I mean, clearly for Denmark, it was huge. I think the only way you can put it is you've got to think of it as somebody at that, how important the Royal Navy was to us at that time. And if somebody had literally come and taken the Royal Navy off us, it would have, to the Danes, it was just the same. It was, it was something that was something so fundamental to the psyche of them that it was incomprehensible that we didn't have it. I think, I do think that you have to look at it, and that's a level. But certainly, as soon as it happened, the French force that was on the border was invited to help them. It sort of came into Zealand, and that's how you also end up with Spanish troops on Zealand, who end up going back to Spain in a little while's time, etc. So all of that gets involved as well. But yeah, it's clearly there's only one way for them to go at this stage. I mean, they are now firmly against Britain and will be for the rest of the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah, genuinely not all of that surprising.
No.
If folks want to go and do a bit of reading about a similar-ish, a time when the shoe is sort of on the other foot, albeit from the Dutch, go and read about the Anglo-Dutch Wars in the 1670s, I want to say, when the Dutch are incredibly successful at humiliating the Brits at sea, including sailing up the Thames and burning the royal flagship as it sits at dock. So, it's hugely humiliating for the Danes, which leads us to the trickiest question, perhaps, of the lot, and the one to which there is no right or wrong answer, I guess. Was it the right move? Because from a purely Machiavellian standpoint, I would just about say yes, it was. But that's ultra Machiavellian, and you've got to think about sort of the macro geopolitical ramifications. So what's your read on this? Was it the right decision ultimately?
I think I'm somewhere in the same camp as you, really. I can see all of the reasons not to do anything, and it shouldn't have happened, and that we were breaking all sorts of conventions and sort of of society at that time. But unfortunately, wartime often makes you make decisions that in fact you really don't want to have to make, but in regard to you winning the war are actually quite important, and you have to sometimes go against what your natural grain would be. And I've mentioned the Winston Churchill thing. I don't think Winston Churchill, I don't think he never actually voiced any form of regret, I don't think, for sinking the French fleet. And I can understand that, because having made the decision, I think you've just got to basically take it on the chin when you're going to get quite a lot of even your own people questioning what you've done. But ultimately, I'm not sure how many other options the British had. They clearly didn't know what the future held. They didn't know that 1812 was going to happen and change the entire picture in Europe. They could only see a very dominant France on the continent, who now was actually in league with all of the other major powers in Europe, and the only people in their way, as far as they could see, was actually Britain and its navy. And it was, I think, pretty obvious that the next stage for Napoleon, if he hadn't got involved in other wars in Europe, was to try to actually defeat Britain's dominance at sea. And that for the British was very scary indeed. Because we also have to bear in mind that in 1807, we have still got an army who has not proved itself to be particularly good at any time in the recent past. It's had an awful lot of disasters.
Indeed, it has. Before people start going, oh, but Wellesley, remember people, this is Wellesley's first European engagement. Yeah. He is not Wellington. That is all to come in the future. And frankly, I would advance the argument that it's Wellington that salvages much of the reputation of the British Army during the course of the Napoleonic Wars, which, without that, a few exceptions to be noted. But those exceptions aside, it's just generally really very poor.
Yeah.
Okay, so two quick ones to end on.
Okay.
How much can we see today? I mean, folks may not be aware that you are a respected battlefield guide. folks, if you want to be led by one of the best and most knowledgeable people about certainly Waterloo, but also of the Peninsular War, go get in contact with Gareth and discuss fees and all the rest of it. But with that in mind, how much of the area over which this is fought is visible today? Because the Danes have done a lot of reclamation of land, from what I understand, and inevitably cities expand. So
yeah, they have. I mean, there's a lot of reclamation to the harbour, but actually, surprisingly, a large amount of what we're talking about in both 1801 and 1807 is still there. The northern half of the defences is largely gone, but the southern half is virtually still there as it was. You can actually walk along them today and see exactly how it was, with the wet ditch and the defences behind it. The northern side, actually, you can follow the line of it, because if you go in the parks, which is on that side now, there is a zigzag stream running through it, which just happens to be the old wet line of the ditch. So you can actually exactly see where the wall was. And then within it, the citadel's still there. The arsenal is a very good visit. The arsenal has got the a huge artillery sort of number of pieces there, including the best kept set of Royal Horse Artillery guns that I have ever seen, in immaculate 1813 condition, never repainted, never redone anything with. They are exactly the same as they were, and the Danes just let you walk all over them and sort of open the boxes and have a look inside and everything else. It's all perfect. So if you ever get there, have a look at that. There's obviously other stuff regarding 1801 as well, because obviously you've got some of the naval dockyard is still there. You can obviously go out into the harbour, and you've got the sort of the Crown Battery, etc. So there is quite a lot that is still there, and you get a real feel for it in Copenhagen. It's a lovely city, and it's worth doing. The other thing you can actually do is obviously Kronborg, which is involved in this as well, up on the coast, is still there, and Frederiksværk is very much worth a visit as well if you ever had the chance, because the gunpowder factory is still there. And although it got updated a little bit in the Victorian period, the black powder factory is still there, and they will actually show you it working, etc. So it's a really good little visit as well. I have done a group tour around the actual sort of Copenhagen and the rest and Zealand, and it went extremely well. There's a lot to find.
There you go, folks. Consider that. I'm very tempted by what you've just said. I shall go and have a little look at the finances and see what can be done in that score. Because
I was only going to say, you just need to be very careful, because unfortunately, one thing about Copenhagen is not the cheapest place in the world.
Yes, I have heard that rumor. But there you go, folks. There's something to at least salivate over in terms of the prospect of a guided tour by Gareth through Copenhagen. No doubt there will be some good wine involved as well. So one final question. How do the Danes remember this today? Because you could be forgiven for thinking that this might be regarded by them as a war crime. Case could be made for that. Certainly plenty of reason for resentment, but it was 200 years ago and a lot has happened since. Does this even get remembered?
Yes and no. I was quite surprised. There is some knowledge of the fleet being taken, and the fire in the city and the sort of everything else. But like a lot of countries these days, the teaching of history, should we say, of their own history, is not always as great as it perhaps should be. And I'll go no further than getting on that sort of bandwagon, because I'll open a huge can of worms there. But I have met a lot of Danes who you just chat to over there, and they will know a little bit about the Great Fire. They'll know possibly about the fleet being stolen, whatever, as they see it. but it also gets confused and conflated with 1801 and Nelson coming and having a battle there. And a number of people, Danes I spoke to, were telling me that, in fact, Nelson is actually the man who they actually blame for stealing the fleet.
He's dead.
Exactly. So, but the two things have become confused and conflated. And I think, unfortunately, that's true. That's not true of every Dane. Obviously, there are a number of Danes that do know the history quite well. But the general man and lady on the street hasn't got a huge understanding of it, and they do tend to get sort of all brought together a bit and confused.
Ghost sailed into the little harbour of Copenhagen, unhitched them all single-handedly, tied them to the back of HMS Victory, and sailed them home. The story of Copenhagen that you never thought you knew. It's a facetious point, quite frankly, on which to end. Gareth, thank you for having the patience to stick with a 2-hour recording.
You're most welcome.
Folks, GarethGloverCollection.com, where you'll find the assorted, the lengthy list of, I think it was 129 you said.
118 at the moment.
118, apologies, I'm over.
It'll be 129 next year.
Good to hear. But folks, we jest. The rate at which this guy produces books that you need on your shelf is sickening, quite frankly, to those of us who look on with envy. But it's done through exceptionally hard work. Go and start filling up your bookcases. Plenty of them are available at Pen and Sword, where you will find Gareth's book on the 2 battles of Copenhagen. Gareth, of course, will be back to talk about First Copenhagen in due course. While you're there, you may find that the code podcast10 helps you to acquire even more titles, because if you're saving 10%, then surely that's an indication that you need to buy more to make up for that saving. You can see that I am not good for your bank balance, people. But go and avail yourself. Have yourself a merry early Christmas. Why not? I'm sure your other halves will thank me not at all for encouraging you to spend excessive amounts of money. But seriously, folks, there are some great books to be enjoyed by Gareth. Go and get your hands on them. I particularly recommend Waterloo Myth versus Reality if you're only looking for one. Gareth may disagree in terms of what his best title is. Anything that you particularly think people should acquire?
Well, look, you've mentioned the main ones. To be fair, I mean, I will say it's Myth and Reality. Sorry, I'll just bench that one. Yeah. No, that's right. It's just if they type that in, they might get something else if they put verses in.
I might need to update my bibliographies actually, because I might have put that in wrong.
Anyway, right, okay. And on top of that, I mean, obviously, my book on the Mediterranean, which is it's been named as the Forgotten War against Napoleon, but the point is that it's only known for little bits and pieces, and that there is a complete campaign going on there, the entire war, and that they're interlinked. And just mentioning that, so that's the 3 books that actually cover that sort of stuff. And then obviously memoirs. I mean, there's dozens of them that I could mention, because I mean, and I will say the latest is always my favorite. So, just coming around the corner now, we have a commissary in 2 volumes coming up now. Tupper Carey, who writes, as I was telling Zach earlier before we started, really is amazing, because it's the first time I've actually had somebody that was a commissary that actually tells me what he actually did as a job, rather than all his womanizing and his, sort of chasing a bit of skirt and sort of and food and drink and all the rest of it, but actually gives a proper understanding of what, for the first time I've ever got, is what a commissary actually did in life. And it sounds a little bit boring, but actually it's not. It actually is quite interesting story there. But so whatever's next on the list is always my favorite.
Having just mentioned the Mediterranean book, which I remember reading quite some time ago and really enjoying, it has occurred to me there are about 15 podcast episodes to be done based around that book. So you may have made a rod for your own back there. But that is a point on which to end. Gareth, thank you so much for your time. I look forward to seeing you again for Copenhagen 1 in the not too distant future.
You're welcome.
Folks, if you're new here, remember to hit the subscribe button so that you can find your way back. And if you're loving the show, please remember to leave a review. It's the most powerful thing you can do to help the show reach a wider audience on our quest for 1 million downloads. Much love to all my Patreon supporters. Shout outs to my mentioned in dispatches patrons: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Coulson, Jim Getz, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, an anonymous American, Martin Pisani, Ulrich Ducardo, James Fluick, Roger O'Donnell, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, David Milinsky, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, and Jason Morn. And the Admirals: John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Ned Campbell, Graham Goodwin, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Steve Carter, and Clemens. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Hey, it's Danny Pellegrino from Everything Iconic. Ready to upgrade your style game without blowing your budget? Check out Quince. They've got all the good stuff, shirts and polos, activewear, and fine leather goods, all at 50 to 80% less than other high-end brands. And the best part? They're all about safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Get that luxury vibe without the luxury price tag. Hit up quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns on your next order. That's quince.com/upgrade.